Hello, welcome to the meeting tent, an ongoing discussion, informal discussion about the work of Stan Tenen. Today we are going to expand on a lot of the conversation we had last week, but before we go ahead, let's introduce our cast of characters. Levanah Tenen, Michael Andron, and back with us again, Adele Packer. Thanks for joining us again, Adele. We're going to expand on what you were discussing in our last episode. And Michael, we're going to hear from you in terms of what we've been talking about. Before we do, though, I wanted to talk about something in the book that I think it's really important to share in understanding Stan's perspective. And it helps to use this as a guide in understanding a lot of the principles that we're talking about. And in fact, we should incorporate this idea. And this Stan's unique ability to look at things multidimensionally. And it appears a lot in the book. It's interesting that when Stan did a presentation, he really didn't allude to this. He didn't start saying, I'm looking at things multidimensionally. It never said that. But if you look in the book, it's pretty obvious. I want to show you an example. So this is on page 251 of The Alphabet That Changed the World. And it's a perfect example of looking at something in various dimensions, and each dimension having a story or having a meaning. In this case, the discussion had to do with the inverted T, which we're going to get to later. And he's using what he calls a tree in the garden through dimensions from a point sphere to a sphere point. And as you can see, he starts with 0 dimension and showing just the point. Actually, it's 7 in a point. And I'm not going to go into details about this particular model. I just wanted to use this as an example. 1 dimension, we're looking at a circle in 1 dimension. Looks like a line. And as we go through the 2 dimensions, it becomes an actual circle that we can see. The beginnings of a tree. In the 3 dimensions, it's a sphere, and it's modeled as a cube octahedron. And in 4 dimension, it's a hypersphere. So we're seeing actually the sphere, hypersphere that contained the 6 model hands that we talked about before. And it's if we could go through life understanding this idea of dimensionality and what each dimension represents, you'll see it in the creative process. For example, that's why I was hoping Daniel would be here, because for a musician, for example, you start with a spark. It just spark of inspiration, let's call, in 0 dimension. And then in 1 dimension, it becomes the idea. And in 2 dimension, it becomes musical notation, which in itself is a formal language. And in 3 dimension, it's the performance. And it's 4 dimension, it's the audiences absorbing that idea and that spark. Now for Adele, she can skip the 2nd dimension. She can go from the spark, the idea, straight to the performance, without having to even go to the 2nd dimension. I mean, I'm sure you can make notes and some level of flatland, but and then the audience gets the feeling and shares this 0 dimension spark. And that's basically the path of the creative process. So as we go forward, if we as as we discussing Stan's work, can keep this in mind as we go through the book and come up with various perspectives that he's presenting. Keep in mind how he sees it. And I think we can kind of root this all out using this as a kind of a model. Yes, Levanah.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you brought it up. And I'm glad you used that particular poster because I'm sure we'll be coming back to it many times. There's a whole lot of different ways of looking at that information that are indicated on that poster and coded in that poster, so to speak. The basic figure, what we've been calling the inverted T, and particularly if you think of it in its two-dimensional form, where you've got an actual circle that you can see and then the line. It is an apt geometric metaphor for the contrast between the earth plane, if you consider what goes around comes around. It's where you got, in other traditions, you have the wheel of karma, what you do comes back to you. But then on the other hand, there's this line that goes to infinity. It shoots up, and that is together it's a contrast between, in a sense, the earth plane and the transcendent, something that comes in from outside of everything, something that goes off to infinity farther than we can conceive. There are so many contrasts that, have been talked of philosophically, the contrast between the one and the many. Visualizing it in this way and seeing how that applies even to observing social trends, to observing trends of, what motivates groups of people. I have found it a really useful geometric metaphor in my own life, even with just the very simple basic of earth plane, where we're bound physically, and transcendent, where our souls come from, where we reach, where inspiration comes from, where novelty comes from. Mm-hmm. Traditionally in Judaism, the earth plane, what we are considering as the earth plane, is one of the two names which is associated with judgment. If you think of judgment and karma, what you do comes back to you. Mercy happens. It's something that may or may not, that's not necessarily reflected in what you do comes back to you. I notice Michael looking sort of seriously at me, so I may be misstating this.
No, not at all. Those two names, the four-letter name of God, which we say Hashem, and Elohim, the Hashem is the vertical, and it's what's outside the world. That was the Aleph.
That's right.
From which that came down and became the Elohim, which is a plural word. And you think, such a big deal about God being one, why is there a plural word like Elohim, which means gods? Because it refers to the white light, so to speak, becoming all the different colors, except not a rainbow of 7, but of 10, of the 10 sphirot that created the world. That was, and I'll come back to this later on something, but that was where Stan entered the picture, because he started with the bet. He didn't deal so much with the initial Aleph, but because he saw that Aleph bet, the first line of Breshit, he didn't see Aleph bet Gimel Daled Hey in order. He saw Breshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning. So he started there. he was already down here
Mhm.
in this world where that bet started. And as he points out in the book, it ends with the last letter of that first sentence, which is the final tzadi,
Mhm.
which is the 27th letter.
Mhm.
So when you're counting that way, it's sort of like there's the Aleph and all the world of bet.
Mm.
Well, don't forget, he also points out that the bait and the Sadi, if you put them together, become the Aleph.
Mhm.
There was
That's going to
something
be,
that,
I had that picture.
yeah,
Yep.
the thing that I forgot, I was going to mention the fact that Stan points this out in the book, that what he is also showing in every one of these dimensions is an example of maximum contrast. And he points out maximum contrast is represented by the letter bait, inside and outside, the contrast between inside and outside. And also the other thing is what this represents, this is crucial to understanding, is that he's showing in almost all of his graphics and posters a sense of movement.
Mhm.
Nothing is static.
Mhm.
It's all about movement. Life is movement. It's moving. God is a verb. And that is why it's essential that we get these posters animated. Once we get these animated, we'll be able to really show and tell this story. And just a side note, and I'm working on getting the hand model, and we're making plans for that. The hand model is useless without the story, and the story needs the hand model. If you don't present the story uh, that created it, then it's just a wire, a bent wire. But when you know what the meaning is and the story behind it, then and that goes hand in hand with making the hand model, is the film that tells the story that includes the animation. Yes, Levanah.
Yeah, something that Stanley always used to say, and he probably says it many times on the various videos that he recorded, is that, he always used to say, don't be overly impressed by the fact that there is a model that makes the letters, that you
Mhm.
can take any bent coat hanger and twist it up in ways to make letters. But the fact that this is actually a meaningful shape and meaningful in many different ways, it's significant in and of itself. And that is where the letters come from, is
That's right.
something that is meaningful in the first place, in the structure of the world that we live in. Um, and we may wind up getting into more of that as these lectures continue.
I believe we will, yes. If Levanah is referring also to a portion of the film, the first verse, that's on our website, www.meruvideo.com. It's called The First Verse. And on that video, Stan's going through, and if you've never seen it, and you're watching him, and he's going through and he's showing how he shines a light through the model, and it projects the letters, and he's saying here is an alphabet, or a model that comes from the letters that wrote the text that created the model. And so we're sitting there all impressed. And the next thing he says, but don't be overly impressed. If I had taken the coat hanger, I could have done it. It just like takes the air out of what he has just shown you. But his
Mhm.
point being that the fact that it has a meaningful model, it's meaningful. And then he goes into talking about the hand gestures, and how there is the meaning behind that specific shape. And yeah, we definitely will be talking about this in much more. Yes, Edel.
I just wanted to say that I love when I can embody something. So, I mean, that's part of my dancer mode of being.
Persona.
Like, I want it to land in my body. So, um, when I saw the various geometric shapes, beginning with that inverted T, the
Mhm.
first thing I thought of was, in my body, I am lengthening and I am widening. That's how I understand presence through my background in somatics, which is the Alexander technique. But it's redundant with so many forms, whether it's yoga or any other form. My cat's joining the picture. There he goes. So right away at that dining room table, when I first met Stan, and one of the first images he showed was the inverted T, this idea of the one and the many. I just saw it in my body. Like, I can make a dance about that, like the first thing I saw. So even though it looks like a flat thing on the page, it's such a meaningful model. And then to see how he opened the floor of the model to have 3 dimensions, like, to me, even though it's flat, like a flat earth, it's shooting out in all directions. And it's so meaningful with the idea that all that we know on this earth plane is reflected above in the one, because it's all one. And that's why it's so beautiful that the Bet and the Sadi form the Aleph, because we are a reflection of what is above. And that he was steeped at that point in reading about Jewish wisdom, the old Hasidic wisdom, the Zohar wisdom, the stories. He was so well read. That was the other thing that impressed me, was the list of resources. And when he would be talking, I'd be jotting down the name of a book. Who would have thought I could read The Generations of Adam by Horowitz? But I was inspired, and I purchased the book, and I've now been through it many times, and it has writing all over it, and it's totally esoteric, poetic. It's so fascinating. So that's what looks flat on a page. Even the dots, how he moved the spheroid dots from a triangle into a flat line, and from a flat line into a triangle. I used that in my choreography with 10 dancers. We moved in and out of, it was almost like a halftime at a football parade. The 10 dancers marking the floor and realizing that we can form a triangle and we can keep turning that triangle. And there's always a head as you turn it a third, was so beautiful as movement, even if the audience didn't know exactly the source that it came from.
Yeah, that's
So that's what excited me and still excites me
That's what's
about.
so cool about what you do. I mean, you're doing what we were talking about. You're turning it into movement, and you said flat on a page. That's the 2-dimensional version, but you're
There's
bringing
there's a picture in the book, Bill, which you might want to integrate. That's the one on the Dirac delta function, going like this.
Right.
And he always thought of that in motion, always. Something that he also used to say, particularly later, as the words kind of coalesced, the reason why, if people think of geometry like we've been kind of talking about, they think of it as like some kind of dead thing in a math class. But no, think about it. Geometry, in the sense of physical form on Earth, is something that every living creature on this earth has in common. So if you're looking for a commonality, at the very basis of things, we live in geometry.
That's right.
We live, that exploration of the shape of things, even the shape of us, that's geometry. And it's a different way of thinking about a subject that most people relegate to, oh my God, I had to take that in high school, I hate it. But that's not what it is at all. It's actually the shape and shapes of our lives and the world we live inside of.
That's right. And it's a structure of our world. When you think about, if you just think about the 3-dimensional world, the man-made 3-dimensional world, the structures, it's a geometry that went multi-dimensions. Once again, it went from a 2-dimensional blueprint, all made up of geometry, of relationships, into a 3-dimensional building or world around us. And that's the symmetrical world that we live in. And then the asymmetrical world, nature, has a geometry to it. And that's basically the model. The model represents the asymmetry and the symmetry of basically the world we live in a three-dimensional and all dimensions, really, in a four-dimensional, that's the only thing we have access to, existence. And so that's what we want to really keep hammering at, to get, because, you know, when you open the book, it's not a narrative. I mean, you know, and I always recommend just skim through it just to look at the graphics and see if there's anything that just grabs you instinctively before you really pour into what it represents. You don't have to read it from beginning to end. I think it's good to read the beginning and the end maybe first, to get Stan's introduction and then his conclusions, and then kind of work. But one of the great things about this book, even if you just go to the footnotes, it's just a wealth of information. But in terms of understanding and getting to this mutual understanding, so we're all talking the same language, we want to adjust our minds to this idea that we're talking about right now, this idea of transcending dimensions and what it means. And Levanah, what you're saying in terms of geometry, that's what geometry does. And basically it's the mathematics that does that. And it's as close to an art form as it gets in mathematics. And there's a lot of discussion about that. Yes, Adele.
You were mentioning the creative process as you looked at that series of images, and you were relating it to music. And I was thinking about it in terms of dance. The piece that maybe you skipped over was you have the inspiration, right? You see something that seems to grab you and won't let go. You know, you're following your curiosity. But I think when you get to the point of that T, you're maybe there. I don't know where it's represented, but it's called, in dance, it's called movement research. Movement research. And really, you're just testing out ideas on your own body and you're seeing where it might go. Oh, you've got this little motion. Where would it go if I turned it, or if I extended the phrase? Where would the phrase take me? What image will help me finish this phrase? Don't like that. Try it a different way. Reverse it. Try it on the floor. Change the movement pattern on the floor. So you're constantly shuffling these movement ideas in 3 dimensions, and suddenly something sticks. Like, yes, that feels like I can use that. And you repeat it enough to remember it. And you're putting it together, and pretty soon it's a sphere, it's a hypersphere, it becomes a performance, it becomes a piece of art. But it's really chiseled for a long time, and sometimes people don't realize that. Unless you're improvising, that's different. But if you're creating choreography, it's just as much work as the sculptor, sculpting away at that wood until suddenly form is created. And I know there is a thread in his work and in those letters that is about the creative process itself.
And it
It's very exciting.
yeah, and it shows up in other ways. You know, the creative process you're talking about is pretty obvious. But Michael, the work that you do, and you've researched over the years, and you came to all these conclusions and these discoveries, similar to what Stan was doing. I mean, it was the same process. You had a spark, something sparked, and then it turned into an idea, and then you start researching it, which is the 2-dimensional level, and then somehow you bring it into the world, but you're also bringing in it from different things that you've discovered that's not even related, like Qigong or you know, Tai Chi, or you know, all the different things that you were learning simultaneously, and all of a sudden there it is. It all comes together, and plus the rabbinic studies that you were doing.
And I just before I explore that, if Dan were here, and he may just pop in here at some point, watching his tape where he explains how he translated each of the letters into a musical, I don't know if note is the right word, but a musical expression, and then created the same way that it went from that point in your mind, Adele, through movement. It came through his through music, which is as close to mathematics as we have. It's like there's algebra and there's geometry, and his is more algebra and yours is more geometry because it's being taken into the physical. There's an expression in the Desiderata, which is an old piece of wisdom that said, whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. And it does. Signs appear. We don't pay attention to that sign, there'll be another one. It's like that old Twilight Zone where you're going down the road and you keep seeing the same guy no matter how far you go until finally you realize what it's about. Yeah, it all begins with signs. Back in 1985, very close to Stan's timetable, his sign was seeing the line of Breshit, of the first line of the Torah, without spaces. And he saw a pattern. I don't know that that was the first thing, but I remember very clearly in the book, he talked about that. And he saw something in that. I mean, I've seen that line a gazillion times. And I certainly saw no pattern to the shapes of it. But a pattern came to me, and if you'll excuse me, I'm going to share the screen here too, because that's how I viewed it. A pattern came to me. It's a whole story, and I'm not going to bore you with the story, but this was the shape that I saw, and it appeared to me not in one fashion, like carved on a door like this, but actually in 3 dimensions in my life as well. And I saw that, and I began to meditate on the shape. Like, what does this mean? And I went into a meditation, and what happened was, there's just a drawing of it, so that you can see some of the curves and things like here and so on that are very similar to some of those Mobius loop curls in his hand model. And it reminded me of an aleph, but not the total aleph, because if I took an aleph is made up of a yud above, a vav in the middle, and a yud below, like the 10 energies from God coming from the top, and then going through this into the physical world. This would be the line of delineation, and then into this world. Well, if you now go further and take that and put it inside, the two were very much the same shape. And so I began to this was what was happening in my mind as I was watching it. And in time, the letters began to morph in my head. I didn't have any shadows pointing through models. It was all inside my head, that this, which was kind of like a final aleph, like there are final letters, it's as if that yud going inside of here, and then it came alive, and here was the aleph. And then it curved into a bet, and curved into a gimel, and into a daled. And it's moving around me in 3 dimensions in my mind. And coming way back here to the final tzadi, and back to the aleph. And it was a snake eating its own tail, an image of the Ouroboros that he uses quite extensively. Because of my martial arts and healing background, the shape, when turned upside down, became very similar to the Hoku Ridge, the meeting of the valleys. And Hoku means star in Hawaiian, and among the Kahuna, in the Huna tradition, this motion, which is the position that your hand is in when you take the hand model, this was what was going on inside my head. And the sphirot, the energies that are all around us, are in Kabbalah attributed to the fingers. So there are 10 fingers and 10 sphirot, and they work. And when they are in this position, they're in stasis. When they're in this position, a tension is produced. And that can be focused in laying on of hands, in lifting for the priestly benediction, in all of these things, in prayer. Now, if you take a look at the Aleph, and then that Yud coming down, and here's an upside down Sadi. So it's moving in the circle all around, and you just flip the hand model around this way and that. First of all, you get a bet. I mean, here's a really obvious one without a shadow picture of it. And these are all from the book. And this shape, if I flipped it and reversed it, you can see the word gentle, which I couldn't crop out, is now backwards. When I flip the picture, to me, I'm looking at the same picture. So when I started reading, there we go. When I started reading the book, I'm looking at these shapes and saying, I've been here before. I've done this in my head. And I was sitting in the first row of the mezzanine looking down and watching the same thing unfold in front of me and around me. The Taiji part now became taken into movement. All of these motions, wave hands like clouds, okay? As you move, all of these motions in both the soft and the hard martial arts, but it's easy to see in the soft stuff. I didn't imagine going through this and years of exploration of this, that somebody else was doing this in dance somewhere. Well, the time maybe subsequently, but somebody was taking this into dance and somebody else was taking this into music. And my math was okay, but it wasn't about to turn into music. But there are people, there's no question, I know people like that because of my years in theater. Those are the people you want to go to if you have a music question, because they can take that simple melody and turn it into something spectacular. I also had somewhat an advantage in that it took it not only into the mystical and the movement, but into science. That extremely low frequency magnetic fields produced a change, and that the hands reflected that movement. In the martial arts, it's not enough to just throw a technique to block or strike or whatever. It's, you have to fill it with energy. If you're going to break stones with your hand just by slapping them and just with energy and not with hard force, there's something else other than your hand, because your hand will bounce off that thing plenty of times and it's going to hurt after a while. But when you get it tuned to the right vibration, the stone just breaks or the boards just fall away. You don't even feel it, and there's no damage to the hands. That was the world I came from, and I felt when I opened his book that this was what was happening. Like, we took tefillin into a Faraday cage, the phylacteries that men, generally men, women too sometimes, wear when they pray, and the Jewish religion has scrolls inside, that produced an energy effect inside of a scientific laboratory. And people who charged water and then gave the water to someone for healing, charged water, and it all came down to a fundamental process. And it's the same process that when this researcher I worked with, who studied healers all over the world, and they all put their hands out as if they were holding that hand model, that they were all producing 8 hertz, just as the tefillin did, just as the water did, 8 cycles a second. There was and if you hollowed out the earth and rang it like a bell, 8 cycles a second, approximately, the Schumann resonance. All of this stuff was happening, and you kept on digging deeper. When I saw the video of Adele's choreography, I went, yeah, you know, if I turn my fingers into people and I started doing this, all of a sudden I had a dance with no skills to be able to do anything with it. It certainly didn't look as good as what you were creating in choreography, but that was what it was. And in the end, the GPS, that is to say, God's positional system, okay, took us, and it never ends. I think that was the discovery that I thought I had something going there, and look at this. It took a slight turn. It still will get to the destination like the GPS. It's just it's going to take a turn through movement. It's going to take a turn through music. It's going to take a turn through geometry. It's going to take a turn through all of this stuff. It's like the half-life of uranium or something, which, you know, a half-life idea is that this will decay or whatever in a half-life. So it's 1,000 years, then it's 500 years, and it's 250 years, and so on and so on. And now it's down to a day. Now it's down to half a day. Now it's down to a quarter of a day. Do you ever get there? No, you never get there because you keep cutting what you had in half. So it's like, okay, this is a never-ending story that goes on and on and on. And as I read the book, I said, I totally didn't go this way, but we're getting to the same place and almost in the same time frame. I mean, when he had so many of these discoveries, I had initial stuff in the 70s, and then the 80s was a big point. And it was like, and he's talking about this in the book, and I'm saying, wow, this is like it broadens what you can draw from. If I can draw from the 3 or 4 major things that I spent my life doing, whether it's martial arts or yoga or healing or rabbinics or whatever, I've just expanded the model. Now it's music, now it's dance. And who knows what else?
You know, the best thing about this, Michael, is that you must have, I mean, doing all this work and trying to talk to people about this and, you know, getting that blank
Not
look
easy.
that we're all familiar with, you
Yep.
know, that rolling eyes like, oh gosh, what is he talking about? I mean, that must have given you such verification that somebody else,
It was, yeah.
and it makes,
was.
and the thing is that, you know, in the whole world, there's only 14 million Jews. And I would assume that Jews would be on this path because of our upbringing and our,
Should be.
yeah. But, you know, it makes you wonder, is there anybody else who,
Oh yeah,
who's doing, you know, this and coming out with the same conclusions? Because we never
but my yoga teacher got it. She was teaching for 60 years when I first met her. I was with her for 10 years between the time she was 80 and 90. My martial arts teacher, who was much younger when I came into him, and now is in his 70s, and my healing teacher right in the middle of that. To have 3 teachers in their 20s, in their 40s, and in their 80s, and in each of those worlds, finding the same thing. In each of those worlds, if you look at the character for Tao, okay, which looks like a man on a path on the left, and 3 things coming in like the letter Shin into a multi-dimensional. Here's one picture of the character Tao. Okay, you have a Shin, which has 3 or 4, just like the ones on the tefillin, coming down into the world and coming down into the multiple levels of our soul. And here's the man walking on his path, the Tao, the way. That it wasn't enough to have the physical action, which is what you just alluded to a few minutes ago, but it had to have the inner dimension, like inside that head, that little point of the man's head is a connection to the transcendent, and the ladder bringing it down into that man's inner being. This is the hyperspace world. This is our ladder to the hyperspace world. And this is what changes. So that when you are walking with the Tao, you are perfecting the Tao, the way. The Hebrew word derech is like Daurech. It's like as you're following a path, but consciously. If you shut off that part on the right, the left is just a guy walking around.
Right. Yeah.
And the last word of the first pasuk, just to say that, is Aretz, the earth. Take away the Aleph, and you heard the word rots, which means running around. You're just running around in a circle. An atom, without the aleph, there's just dam, blood. It's a body thing. But when you put the aleph in it, the letter that represents that unity, and that you turn on that light and it becomes awake, you revel at everything you see that reflects that. And so, yeah, that was my reaction, which is why I said, I got to meet this guy. I didn't know where he was. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know if he was alive, or I had to meet him. And with great struggling, we did, but nothing's an accident.
I want to play just a piece from that same video I was referring to before. And here's Stan, a comment that Stan makes on that tape.
This is a wonderful model of everything. By definition, this isn't a jealous God of a petty people who says, my God's bigger and better than your God because it's my God, and it's the one God because I say so. That's not what we're saying here. I'm saying we are starting with a definition of singularity and wholeness. Definitions are not the basis of prejudice. It's a postulate. I'm putting it down to see how good it is. It doesn't give us anything. And if we look for the means of spanning between the one and the many, we have a path that includes everything in the universe. Now, modern physics attempts a bottom-up reconstruction. Take all the diversity we find, all the forces in the world, and pump the energy up until things merge together, and eventually we can extrapolate and find the Big Bang, the one from the many. And I'm saying we can do this abstractly. We can do this topologically in principle, without any electron microscopes and cyclotrons and supercomputers. We can start top down by definition, start with a singularity, break it up by minimal first distinction, and end up with all there is.
So we're going to be discussing this a lot. I think that we're on to a path here, and we want to turn this, or we want to be transcribers, I guess, of Stan's work and bring our different perspectives and get others as well as we move along on this program. Idel, last week we got your wonderful presentation of how the dance developed, but it's not only the dance, it's the gestures also. And you have many other experiences in terms of the gestures and the alphabet and the letters, and maybe you could talk more about that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to share Michael's moment where he said, I want to meet this man. It's very rare that I travel. And I just said, I want to go and meet Stan and ask him questions. And I reread the book for the second time on the plane. I underlined and I had questions. And I was so basic in my understanding of the Aleph Bet and Judaism. I just started my research based on discovering what these beautiful gestures were and trying to get a little more sense of what this is all about. I had no idea what I stepped into. No idea. Whereas Michael comes from Hebrew studies and rabbinical studies. I came from dance, somatics, and each were in their own world. Like there was the world of dance and there was the world of somatics, and there was kind of just an interest in Judaism, but I didn't really have it integrated with these other big studies in my life. Those were big studies, becoming a certified teacher of the Alexander technique and going back to school and becoming a physical therapist and learning about the body. It felt like categories. And what started to develop from this little seed of curiosity about the letters is a larger envelope that all of my background could fit into. And in fact, I think I've created an embodied practice. Like I can sit or stand and do the gestures through the entire alphabet over and over, and it becomes a moving meditation as beautiful as a long phrase of Tai Chi. So it's unique and people are interested in it. I'm involved in the Embodied Jewish Wisdom Network, which is only 3 years old. And I've been in on it from the beginning. And most people drop in through dance and through yoga. But this is really a unique way to start to embody really beautiful universal messages that are behind the letters. So I feel like I've walked into just something that's giving shape to my whole life. It's really big. And I've studied a lot and I'm going to keep studying. It's now a lifestyle to study Torah, to read and to see how the language is fitting into these concepts. So given that, when I started with the dance, I wanted to let people know, of course, locally, that this performance was going to happen. And the timing was right for this little Jewish food festival that happens every year in our town to join forces with the Torah booth, because what happens at the Torah booth is, and this is people in the Jewish community and people who are just curious to know more about what is this Jewish food festival, that are walking through the town. It's a big public event. And when they get to the Torah booth, they get to see a Torah scroll open. It's covered with, it's protected with a plastic covering and like a fiberglass or something that's covering it. But they get to see it, and then there is a person who will write their name in Hebrew. So they have a little card where they can see their name. So I got this idea that I could be part of the Torah booth. Once they have their name, they would come to me and I would just work with them with the 4 or 5 letters of their name, 3 letters of their name, depending on how long their name was. And look at each letter, gesture it, and show them a little spontaneous gestural dance that is them. I did it all day long at this festival from
Did
10
they
o'clock.
video?
This was
Did
the-
they videotape you doing that? So that
no.
they had a short. It might be a beautiful idea for them to have a video
Yeah.
of you doing their name.
Yeah, I have one little photo that somebody took of me showing a child the hay. It's sort of sweet. But if there were children at the Torah booth, they would come to me. And I had children as young as 3 who had an amazing little attention span. And I'm telling them about themselves through the letters of their name. And the parents are listening. So and then of course I had a little sign up and let them know there's a performance happening. So it was my way of just kind of reaching out a little to the community. But I was stunned at how successful it was, how moved people were to learn something about themselves through the letters that spell their name. Even if it was like a name like Nancy, and the scribe would just put the letters as the letters were in the English name, because not everybody had a Hebrew name, but they came to me with letters and I could sound it out and tell them their name. And then
So that would be Nun, Samek.
Something. Yeah, exactly.
Adele, you've taken palmistry and made it handistry, and it should be an industry, is what it should be.
It's like
of your doing this. This is awesome.
Yeah, it's like telling someone's fortune. So today I was at the. I had to get my eyeglasses adjusted, and because there was a little stuck thing in the frame. And the woman fixed it, and I looked at her name, and I saw that it was the Hebrew name. It was Michal. And I said, that's an interesting name. Is that a Hebrew name? And she said, yes. And the next thing we know, we're talking about, I don't know exactly how it's spelled, but I sounded it out, and I gave her Mem, Chaf, and Lamed. And I think she told me that those were the letters of her name.
Yeah, just an extra yud after the mem.
That's and then yud, the yud first, the mem yud.
Mem yud chaf lamed. Yeah.
Yud chaf lamed, and we went through each letter, and she was so moved. She said, "I think we've done a great exchange." And So I left with my
Did
glasses.
she charge? Did she charge you for the glasses?
No,
She didn't charge you. Good. There you go.
Come on.
He said, wow, you made my day. So that's just one little example, and I've done it many times. I did it at a dance retreat where I was showing a piece of my choreography, but we did a little discussion, and I chose a friend whose name was Kelly. And I know Kelly, I know her personality. So it was just really easy to create the letters of her name. And well, I didn't know that there was another woman sitting in the group whose name was Kelly. So everything I was saying about the letters and about my friend, Kelly, was universal enough that the other woman named Kelly eagerly came up to me afterwards, wanted to see the letters written down. What do these Hebrew letters look like? You know, she was so moved by what I said. It was so her. So I think that there's something really extraordinary and very healing about looking into one's own name. And I taught an entire course on Zoom where that was the focus of the course. And I was surprised at how it took off and it became a muse. So there was a woman who painted really, it was as beautiful as a Chagall. She made this painting. Another person did some calligraphy. Several people created dances. Every single person in the group, and it was about, I don't know, 18 people, wrote poems. I directed them how to write the poem. And the poetry that came out was extraordinary. Everybody got to share their work. I suspended my curriculum, which I was going to do many different things, but everybody wanted to share what they were discovering and creating. And it was quite something. So that was a 7-week course. And then I did another course based on the power of words. Just looking at certain words in Torah as I was learning Torah study, and I was collecting these words that gestured so beautifully. How could we create a course around this? And I came up with a theme, which was Makom. It was the story of Jacob falling asleep on the rock, and the symbolism of the rock, Eben, the essence, and all of the different definitions of the Hebrew, and then to gesture the letters. And that is the videotape that I did share with you, where I had gestured all the words we had learned in that course, which was extensive, so that people could play with them and learn them and review them. So I'm excited. And there's a person in the class who's a teacher of Hebrew to children. And the very first course I taught, and she started incorporating gesture in her teaching of children, and she has the children gesturing every time she teaches a letter, and then they gesture as they learn words, and she's off and running with it. She's quite...
You just made Stan very happy, because
Yeah,
something that he always
Stan,
talked about
children.
and wanted was, you know, this is a way to teach the alphabet to children. But he's
Absolutely.
like the last thing in the world close to, absolutely not a teacher of little bitty kids, you know.
Well, this woman is really, yeah, she's really skilled, and she's doing it, and
Hey,
we're communicating, and she calls me sometimes. She goes, "Can I consult with you? I want to do this. What do you think?" You know, and we just have a lot of fun, and I'm just honoring her. Just go with it, because it's so exciting. And then I've been tutoring 2 boys for their bar mitzvah, just a little adjunct to their regular Hebrew, midweek Hebrew, to kind of encourage them along. It's a family that I know well. And I realized they really didn't know their letters. And I started with the gestures and the meaning of the letters, and we play with words, and I got to experience a little of what that's like to teach children, and they're a little older. Yeah. So I think there's so much to it. I have one more story, but maybe someone else wants to speak.
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, please.
Okay, so we had this food festival again this year for the first time. It was in May. Because of the pandemic, it was suspended. And it was the first time in several years that the food festival was happening again, and again there was a Torah booth. And I had no performances coming up, but I'm always happy to expand my mailing list if somebody might be interested in the courses I'm teaching. And I thought that was enough. And I'll just go and do the same kind of thing. It was so much fun when I did it before. The first woman who came to me had lost 3 children and a husband in a plane crash. She came to this festival from Florida because it was the first time she felt like she could move out, and she'd heard about this little festival in Asheville and decided she would travel and come see it. And I think it's like maybe 9 years had passed. She was finally coming out of grief. Enough to come to something and meet new people and just try an adventure on her own. So I said, maybe you'd like me to do the names of your children. Go back to the Torah booth, get a card for each child, not just you, each child, and then come back to me. And we spent time together with I gestured every child, and there were tears in her eyes. She would say, yes, that was so her. You are just so calling up this child for me. I think that this form, working with people who are grieving, could be extremely healing. And the woman who was doing the calligraphy was actually a young woman whose mother works in grief counseling. And she was witnessing what was happening. She said, you have to meet my mother. And so we had a little talk afterwards. And we didn't really clarify how, when she's doing a workshop, I might be able to come in and work with her. We didn't quite get that far, but I think there's potential there. And it's a totally new idea and a little risky, right? Because it's going to be high-powered emotional, to really look at a loved one's name in that way. So that's my last story that I wanted to tell you, because it was just such an extraordinary experience. And that was the first person who came to me that day. And it only, traveled into depth from there with all the people. There must have been, I don't know, 30 people, and the tip jar just kept getting filled. And I helped out the festival with whatever funds we created from those tips. It's really sweet.
Yeah, so I just have to mirror what Levanah said before. I mean, you're manifesting what Stan couldn't do and would have liked to have done, but obviously, I mean, in terms of movement, in terms of teaching,
Wasn't him.
yeah, and you're really a vital part of this. When I think about it, I mean, Levanah knows the hand gestures. I know I don't have them all memorized. I don't know how much Michael has, but I mean, you are the sole purveyor of the hand gestures on the planet. And so we have to exploit that. and you're going to be a big part of this.
Give me ideas. Give me
No,
ideas.
we will. Believe me.
And I want to team teach with Daniel again. I had a whole curriculum for Daniel and me to do scholar in residence, where he would bring some of his music, he would teach a little Torah and Hebrew, and I would teach some gestures. There's another thing that I've done with the letters. I've been to these they're semi-silent retreats that my rabbi organizes once a year, and I've done them quite a few years in a row. And there are young teenagers, children of participants in the adult group, that come. And there's some young girls who have started like at age 12, and they've gone to this retreat every year, and now they're going to college. So it's been like a lot of time. And every time we meet, I take the 4 or 5 young women who are there for the retreat, and we create a dance with one word that is the theme of the program for that year. So one year we did Yud Hey Vav Hey, and one year we did Tahor, which is pure, because it was about pure heart. And we used some different sources, but they learned the gestures, and we created with some song that they knew, and sometimes somebody else sang, and we did it for Havdalah service. And these young kids, they remember that experience.
Mhm.
So I'd like to do something like that at our religious school locally. I haven't quite hooked in yet exactly what I want to do with them, but I think the potential is there to create something that they can perform,
Mhm.
and
Right.
then they own it once they've had that
Can I
Go
get
ahead.
a quick last word?
Absolutely,
First
Mike.
of all, I really do believe that the people whose names you're translating into movement need to take a video of you, because that kind of stuff goes viral.
Yeah.
Somebody shares it with somebody who shares it with somebody, and it's a way of getting that picture out. The other point was, yes, it's a Jewish thing, a belief that the Hebrew name for someone who's Jewish is a hidden representation of their destiny that they're taught in the womb before they're born. They're not the only ones. I came across a Zen story that was like that. I came across Patrice Malidoma Somé, who was brought up in a village in Africa and left. He was kidnapped as a child, taken to a Christian school, and then walked 125 miles back barefoot back to his village. And in this village, he tells a story how a pregnant mother is taken out, surrounded by the elders, and the voice of the child speaks through and says, "This is what my name is to be." And he tells this story in the context that his mother said his middle name or last name, I don't know, was supposed to be Patrice, is what the Christian school gave him, but Malidoma means friends with the stranger. Now he's living in a primitive type of village. Why would you have a name that means friends with the stranger? And yet it was his destiny.
We'll go ahead and end this episode, to be continued, and with a lot more information to come. So thank you guys again for being. This was really a good presentation gathering, and we'll see you next time. Take care.